Washington, D.C.
Tonight, the primary dust settles. After a series of races across 6 states last night, far-left Democrats swing and miss in Wisconsin's gubernatorial race, but progressives notch a victory in Minnesota's Senate contest, where Mike Lindell of MyPillow fame falls short in his bid for the governor's mansion, while the president's hand-picked successor in South Carolina's Senate race heads to a runoff. We'll discuss it all with former Minnesota Governor Tim Pawlenty and current Wisconsin Congressman Mark Pocan up ahead. Plus, a subdued inflation report. The new numbers out today, easing pressure on the Fed, with core inflation rising at the slowest annual pace since 2021. Bloomberg's Michael McKee is on hand to dive into it all. And total control. President Trump says the U.S. is in control of the Strait of Hormuz, despite frozen talks with Iran, as Tehran's reorganization of its military points to signs that it's preparing for a protracted era of conflict. Former U.S. envoy for Iran, Robert Malley, joins us for more on the ongoing war coming up. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons. Joe Matthew is on assignment. And we begin tonight with a major shakeup at the White House. President Trump announcing his longtime confidant, Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, is leaving her post. Trump writing on Truth Social that Leavitt, quote, will be departing her role at the end of the month so she can spend more time with her beautiful young children and family, a decision I totally understand and respect. For more, let's go now live to the North Lawn of the White House, where Bloomberg's Jeff Mason is standing by. So, Jeff, if she's leaving, do we know who will replace her? Can anyone?
We do. Indeed, we don't, Kaylee. We don't even know if he's planning to replace her. He probably will. The press secretary is a job that all administrations have had for years. But the truth is, in this administration, President Donald Trump serves as his own press secretary in many ways, just like he serves as his own chief of staff and his own top political and advisor on nearly all things. He has said before that the person whose counsel he takes the most is his own. But that does not mean this is not significant. It certainly is. Karoline Leavitt was a top advisor to him, in addition to being his spokeswoman. I've covered a lot of administrations and a lot of press secretaries, and the best ones, Kaylee, are the ones who are in the room and who can then really say what's going on with the president. And Karoline could. Her tenure, however, also includes some pretty major upheavals for the press corps, including having pushed the 3 major wire services, including Bloomberg, out of our permanent seats in the pool. So a controversial figure for sure, but also a very important figure in Trump's orbit. So it is a big shift to hear that she is leaving.
Certainly. Well, as you rightly point out, Jeff, often we aren't hearing things from the White House press office. We're frequently hearing them directly from President Trump, in many cases on Truth Social, where he took to today to say once again that the U.S. is in total control of the Strait of Hormuz. And yet, is there any real movement when it comes to the Strait or any kind of negotiation with Iran right now?
Well, first of all, it's just not accurate to say that the U.S. is in total control of the Strait of Hormuz, because Iran has shown that it can attack ships that are going through the strait as a way of using its leverage over that area. So there's certainly a disconnect between what President Trump is saying and what Iran is saying. And to your question about progress, it seems to be at a standstill right now. The president making that comment suggests, or I think illustrates, how far apart the two sides are. And yet he is not talking, at least at the moment, about an escalation in military attacks. But if he says that he wants the U.S. to maintain its control of the strait, that certainly indicates that he plans to leave the U.S. resources that are out there right now in place for a while.
All right. Bloomberg's Jeff Mason live at the White House. Thank you so much. Now, the energy price shock from the war with Iran continued to fade in July, according to today's subdued CPI report, with energy and gasoline prices falling for a second month and the core metric rising just 2.5% year on year, the slowest pace since March 2021, taking some pressure off the Fed ahead of its September meeting. And joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Michael McKee, live from World Headquarters in New York. So it takes some pressure off, yes, Mike, but how much will it really alter pre-existing thinking?
It really won't at all, Kaylee, at this point, because you mentioned that oil prices went down, so gasoline prices went down in the first part of July. They've gone back up again. They're now above where they were. And so the August numbers are really going to be decisive when we get there. But we did see some improvement in the numbers overall, especially on a year-over-year basis, with just a 0.1% rise in the headline, a 0.2 rise in the core, and that puts us at 3.4% for the headline number for the year and 2.5% for the core, and they were over 4% not long ago. So in that sense, it's progress. But if you look back to before the war started, that's about where we were. And so for right now, the people who were hawkish on the Fed aren't happy because there hasn't been any progress over these months. We've only made a round trip, and 3.4% wasn't good enough for them then.
Well, so then QPPI tomorrow, Mike, should we expect that it's going to be a similar story?
It could very well be because of the energy components in particular. It's not clear what happens with tariffs because tariffs came back on in some areas during July. But overall, we may see either a flat or small rise in the PPI. But what economists are going to be looking for are the categories that feed into the PCE inflation index, because that's what the Fed uses for their 2% target. And some of them in the CPI went up today, like airfares, 2.2%. The big question is, what is the rise in the portfolio management category? In other words, the more trading there is, and there's been a lot, the more Wall Street makes, and that goes into the PPI as an increase. So if that goes up a lot, PCE isn't going to come down, and that gives the Fed more reason to be pressured for a rate increase.
Well, and when we think about the concept of borrowing costs going higher, I also want to ask you, Mike, about the 10-year auction we saw today, $42 billion worth of notes at the highest yield since 2007. We're talking financial crisis era, and I wonder if we should expect that may continue with the trajectory we're currently on.
Well, it was a small tale from what we were expecting, but it does tell you that the markets are at this point thinking that interest rates are pretty appropriately priced. Some of that being inflation. Some of that is probably the budget. We've had a report today that the president's considering more tax cuts to try to drive up the Republican share of the vote in November. That would only add to the deficit, and that would only make Wall Street more nervous. So there's a lot that is going into that 10-year yield, and it doesn't look like it's going to be coming down anytime soon.
All right, Bloomberg's Michael McKee, thank you so much as always. Of course, economic concerns are at the forefront in this year's midterms, which were further shaped yesterday with primaries held across 6 states, including a special contest in South Carolina to fill the seat of late Senator Lindsey Graham, in which his sister, Darlene Graham, Trump's pick, failed to win outright, advancing to a runoff against Congressman Ralph Norman. While in Minnesota's Republican primary for governor, the president's pick, My Pillow founder Mike Lindell, handily lost to Lisa DeMuth, Speaker of the state House, though Lindell is still refusing to concede that race. For more on those races and the direction of the GOP heading into the midterms overall, we're joined by the former governor of Minnesota, Tim Pawlenty. Governor, here in our Washington, D.C. studio to boot, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us on Bloomberg.
Glad to be on Bloomberg.
Well, when we consider the results from your state of Minnesota yesterday, Mike Lindell aside, the wider landscape would point, by and large, to those that side with the president usually coming out victorious in the primaries, even if not in this case. General election politics, though, are very different. And I wonder how you expect general election politics will favor or not the Republican Party.
Well, nationally, and you're exactly right, you know, the president has a pretty strong track record of picking people who survive primaries. Not in every case, and in this case, Mike Lindell did not survive the primary. But in terms of the general election dynamics, your reporting was exactly spot on. We'll be moving from that macroeconomic discussion, which you just had, to household and family and individual budget economics, which is, can you make my gas and energy more affordable? Can you make my health care more affordable? Can you make my groceries more affordable? And what are your ideas? They're going to be looking looking for leaders who have specific suggestions to lower them. And as we know, it's a supply and demand equation. If you have more supply, for example, in the energy area, you make it more affordable. So we need policies to increase the supply of energy as one example.
Well, so when we consider, for example, those energy costs, we know that states have some leeway to do that, looking at a state gasoline tax, for example. But for someone who's bidding for the governor's mansion or for any statewide office, how much are they really able to say that they can control these things if it's being directed in large part from the White House?
Well, they can play a significant role because part of the challenge with energy costs is a bottleneck in transmission. And you have a lot of people who'd be willing to supply energy, whether it's solar or gas or small modular nuclear reactors. But the choke point is the transmission, and permitting at the state and local level is a big part of the equation. Federal permitting, too. But state leaders could do a lot to make that permitting process more streamlined, quicker, so that we can get more energy to market faster, which would help these supply and demand pressures.
Oh, how often we've talked about permitting reform on the federal level, obviously still has yet to materialize in a big way. When we are talking about things that are run on a state level, obviously in this country, states run elections. We have heard a lot from the federal level about the need for changes in the way elections are run. The president is pushing the Save America Act. In this race we're talking about, the gubernatorial race in Minnesota, Lindell is still not conceding, arguing that there may have been issues with the vote. As someone who was a governor of a state, I wonder what you make of the current rhetoric around the security of the vote, whether any of those concerns are valid.
Well, there have been some isolated examples of wrongdoing in elections. For example, in New Jersey, they found, I think, 100 or more ballots of people who are not legal citizens voting. And
error in the DMV system.
An error, yeah. So there are things that do happen. But so far, there hasn't been evidence, actual evidence presented in a court where it's been found to be credible that there's widespread election problems. I know that's been alleged. But the way we prove those allegations in the United States is you bring them to court, you marshal evidence, you present documents, you convince a judge or a jury that there's credibility behind it, or similar government officials. And so far, while there's been a lot of allegations, that kind of evidence hasn't, at scale, hasn't really been produced.
And you never saw evidence of it in Minnesota?
Minnesota has, I would say, minor problems in that regard. But so far, again, allegations of lots of problems. But you got to prove it.
Yeah. Well, that was not the only race we were watching in Minnesota yesterday. There was also the Democratic Senate primary in which Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan was victorious over the more moderate candidate Angie Craig. It really seemed to be a referendum on immigration policy and ICE in the aftermath of the two deaths of American citizens when ICE was in the state earlier this year. Obviously, Angie Craig had voted for the Lake and Riley Act. I wonder how you consider those politics at play in Minnesota specifically, given what the people of your state experienced.
It is a little bit of a microcosm of the rise of the DSA or further left elements within the Democratic Party. So you see that not only in the race that you just referenced, but across the country. And clearly, after the ICE situation in Minnesota, that energized that further left element, or broadly the Democratic Party in Minnesota. And I think that helped Peggy Flanagan win that primary. But I think there was a lot of momentum in the Democratic Party towards this DSA element to begin with. And Angie Craig being deemed a moderate is not helpful in a Democratic primary these days, because if you're a moderate, the base activists tend to be much more liberal in terms of the primary voters. And there's analog is true to that in the Republican Party as well. Although in the Republican Party, because they're so sick of losing for a quarter of a century in Minnesota, they actually nominated in the primary two really credible, good candidates that are arguably the most electable candidates we've had in a long time.
Candidates that could beat, say, an Amy Klobuchar?
Well, Amy Klobuchar is very formidable. I think we put our best foot forward. Lisa Damemuth is somebody I know. She's incredibly talented. And Michelle Tafoya is same category. But in the case of beating Amy Klobuchar, that's going to be an uphill climb.
Amy Klobuchar, interestingly, has resisted calls for a moratorium on new data centers in Minnesota. We've obviously seen governors and would-be, wannabe governors take different approaches to this issue, but it's a hot one in this midterm cycle. How are you considering the notion of the power of AI and the infrastructure required to development, and where you draw the line for protecting citizens and their access to power and water with wanting to invest in an economic engine? Great
points, and those are important questions that need to be addressed. So we need leaders to step forward, whether it's governor, U.S. Senate, local leaders, who will do the following. Let's, instead of just banning things that we know we need, let's try to construct a win-win solution. So what does that look like? If you come to a community with a data center, say, I'm not going to increase the energy prices, and we'll pay for it ourselves or build it ourselves or bring it ourselves. Number two, let's make sure we commit to make the water, it is not drained down, that we want it to be recycled and a closed-loop system. And 3, invest in the community beyond just the temporary construction jobs. Let's have something for the community that is structural and long-term and important to the community. And that doesn't resolve people's generalized anxiety about AI, but it does open up a better discussion, a more constructive discussion about win-win rather than bans. And that would also allow, by the way, more power to come online, because a lot of these data centers are bringing with them proposals for more power.
Do you share the concern that maybe we're overdoing it with the build-out of all of these data centers? Well,
the market is a pretty good indicator of what the demand is, and the market is responding to that by saying we got to have more of these data centers. And so I don't know that it's an overbuilt situation, especially if AI continues to have the momentum it has. But I do think we've got to reset the discussion, because instead of bans and no, we got to figure out how to create solutions. And that's why it's important for leaders to think beyond just simple solutions like we're going to have a ban. Let's make it a win-win for the communities, for the people, and for meeting the need of powering an AI data center or powering any other large-scale user of energy.
All right, Governor, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
For your time. The former governor of Minnesota, Tim Pawlenty, thank you so much. And still ahead, we'll turn from Minnesota to Wisconsin and dissect that state's primary results with a member of its congressional delegation. Democratic Congressman Mark Pocan is up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Karoline. Has the Democratic Socialist movement hit a wall? That's the question being asked tonight after a defeat in the Wisconsin gubernatorial primary last night for Democratic Socialist Francesca Hong, who lost to competitor David Crowley, the Milwaukee County executive, by less than 1 percentage point after polls had suggested a double-digit blowout for Hong. Is it a sign that the DSA may have reached its end, or is there more room for the far-left movement to grow? And how does the party now put itself back together again as we head to the general election? Joining me now on that and more is Democratic Congressman Mark Pocan of Wisconsin, a member of the House Committee on Appropriations and Foreign Affairs. Congressman, welcome back to Bloomberg. I don't know who you voted for, if you did, in this gubernatorial primary, but this was obviously a very tight race. We're talking a margin of just a couple thousand votes. What does that signal in a contest against Republican Tom Tiffany in the general election for how difficult it may be to rally the party now around David Crowley?
Well, the good news is we had a unity breakfast today, and all of the candidates, the final 4 candidates running for governor, as well as Senator Tammy Baldwin, Attorney General Josh Kaul, myself, and others showed up all together to be with David Crowley, who's the Democratic nominee. So I think that part is going to be pretty easy as far as everyone knows. Tom Tiffany is one of the most extreme members of Congress there are. He's part of the Freedom Caucus, the kind of goofy Freedom Caucus that has done all sorts of odd things in Congress. He is one of their members. He's voted with the president to support tariffs that are costing groceries and everyday goods who we're paying more for because of those tariffs. He's voted to support the illegal war, which is making gas prices going up. He voted for one big, beautiful bill that made health care and utility costs go up. And, he fought at every chance he did to release the Epstein files. So this guy is an extremist beyond any Republican even norms that we're seeing. So having, David Crowley out there, I think what the primary really just showed is, Francesca Hong ran a very grassroots campaign. I don't even think she had any dollars on TV. David Crowley had the support of the governor, who's very popular, Governor Tony Evers. And at the end of the day, it was a very, very close race. But, I think people understand Tom Tiffany is such an extremist that, we were looking forward to whoever won that primary taking him on because we can beat him.
Well, it won't surprise you, Congressman, that the Republicans we speak with on this program are saying that the real extremists are those on the far left, like Francesca Hong. And even if she didn't win, Abdul El-Sayed won. We saw Democratic Socialists elected in primaries in New York. What is your response to someone who says that the party is shifting in a leftward and dangerous direction?
Well, I think the Republicans have loved to use Democratic Socialist over and over. Now they're calling us communists. Like, they've lost any credibility. They clearly haven't taken a high school or even a junior high civics class recently because they don't understand the definitions of what they're calling us. But what people do know is they're paying more out of pocket for goods because of actions of Donald Trump and the Republicans in Congress. So when you have a Republican from Congress, whether it be in Michigan, Mike Rogers, or a current member like Tom Tiffany, you have two people who have records, and you can run against those records. In the case of Wisconsin, of Tom Tiffany, he's one of the most extreme members, part of the Freedom Caucus. So we're looking forward to having David Crowley, who was a state legislator, who is the county executive in Milwaukee. He's run a big unit of government, running for governor. But I think sometimes, bluntly, the Washington pundits, some of the Washington consultants love to talk about these sort of things, but they're not talked about in places like Wisconsin every day. So I think, it's great for people with big houses in Virginia to sit on their chair and pontificate. But for those of us who are actively meeting with voters and knocking on doors, what people care about is whether or not they can afford to pay for their groceries and have a family vacation, and not all the other political hyperbole.
Just quickly, Congressman, I do want to ask you about the business that will be before you when you return from recess. How much were positions like those around Thanksgiving a real factor for voters in Wisconsin, do you think?
Yeah, again, I think at the end of the day, we are just moving forward with the nominee we have, and you can dissect this a number of factors, no single factor. That was what made it determinative when you have a race that's 3,000 votes difference. Anything could have been the determinative factor, right? But I think what we're focusing on, and what we're focusing on nationally in congressional races, is that the Republicans have literally let Donald Trump run over the Constitution. Article 1 of the Constitution gives us the power president stealing money that we've approved in a bipartisan way. The power of going to war is rested with Congress unless there's an imminent attack, and we've given up that responsibility to Donald Trump. We've done that with tariffs. Only emergency tariffs are the power of the president. So I think we're focused on the big picture, and I know a lot of people love to kind of continue to talk about some of the, honestly, it's a DC pundit thing I've noticed, that they just can't quite grasp, but we talk about in places like Baraboo, Wisconsin, and Sauk City, and Fitchburg, and places that you probably never heard of. But what we talk about in areas like this are why it's just so hard to get by and afford the basic necessities. Right. And that's what we're focused on in places like Wisconsin in order to win elections.
Well, Congressman, as you talk about the power of the purse, I also want to ask you about that purse. A continuing resolution was passed by the Senate before it broke for recess, runs through December 11th. Is it your intent to vote for it when you return to Washington?
Well, I think this is one where we had it before us in the House, and we'll have to see whatever, because, the House and the Senate Republicans can't agree. The House, keeps throwing the SAVE Act on everything because they're all trying to appeal to Donald Trump to get another invite to Mar-a-Lago. But it's irresponsible for Congress to not do our job. We have 12 appropriation bills that should be done by September 30th. And I think they've put 2 on the floor because, again, they can't govern. People are so tired of that. They want us to get things done for them and their families. So when we get back, I'm sure we're going to have a robust debate about it. But the bottom line is Congress has to work again. Republicans have not done that. They've just done whatever Donald Trump wants. And again, the Constitution has a separation of powers. We are a co-equal branch of government, and unfortunately, Mike Johnson thinks we're a subservient branch, and he won't stand up to the president. Well, Democrats win the House and the Senate, we're going to stand up to the president. We will be a goalie from his bad ideas. We will have oversight. We will make sure that we're having full accountability, and that's what people are asking for.
All right, Congressman, thank you for your time this evening. That's the Democratic Congressman Mark Pocan of Wisconsin. Thank you so much. And still ahead, President Trump is once again claiming that the U.S. has, quote, total control of the Strait of Hormuz. But there's still no formal agreement to reopen it. We'll have more on the state of play with one of the negotiators of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Robert Malley will be joining us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons. Tonight, the president is doubling down on his rhetoric against Iran, declaring via Truth Social, quote, "The USA has total control over the Strait of Hormuz. I think we will keep it." And with talks between the U.S. and Iran effectively frozen, a new report from Bloomberg says Tehran is reorganizing its military to be more aggressive, a sign the regime is preparing for a protracted era of conflict. Yesterday on Balance of Power, we spoke with former Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman about the state of play.
I don't see Iran caving any time to what the president is trying to get done here. Whether over a long period of time that could happen, I don't know. And all the while we put on that pressure, the Strait of Hormuz remains closed.
Joining us now for more is someone who knows Wendy Sherman well, Robert Malley, the former U.S. Special Envoy for Iran and one of the lead U.S. negotiators of the JCPOA, of course, the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. He's now President Emeritus and Program Director for the Middle East and North Africa at the International Crisis Group. Robert, welcome to Balance of Power. Wendy Sherman told us yesterday that she thinks this situation with the Strait of Hormuz could be indefinite, if not forever. Is that the reality of where we find ourselves?
Unfortunately, yes. And I say unfortunately not just because it's not good for Iran or the U.S., it's not good for the rest of the world because the price of commodities that goes through the Strait of Hormuz, fertilizers, products that less developed countries need desperately, those prices are going to go up. I think it's really interesting, or interesting is not the right word. It's sort of, there's something very bizarre in the evolution of U.S. war objectives from toppling the regime to going after their nuclear program to going after their missile program. Then it was opening the Strait of Hormuz, and now, apparently, based on what the president just said, it's keeping it shut. So we just have this bizarre series of war objectives, which shows that we really don't know what we're pursuing, or the U.S. doesn't know what it's pursuing. And meanwhile, the rest of the world is paying the price.
Well, you say the U.S. doesn't know what it's pursuing. President Trump repeatedly says the pursuit here is that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. Can we not take that at face value?
I mean, if that's the objective, and let's, as you say, let's take it at face value, I'm not sure what all of that we've been doing, what the point was. I mean, if you want to negotiate Iran giving up its nuclear program, or at least giving up its military nuclear program, or committing never to have a nuclear weapon, there are ways to do that. I would argue that the JCPOA went a long way towards doing it. It wasn't as perfect as some would hope. So negotiate with Iran, negotiate on their nuclear program. But instead, we've seen a series of shifting objectives and shifting tactics, which, if anything, are convincing the Iranian leadership that they need a nuclear weapon in order to deter future attacks. Now, I'm not claiming that they're about to develop a nuclear weapon. I don't think they have the means to do so right now. I think they know that they're being watched both by the U.S. and by Israel, and that any step in that direction would be met with overwhelming force. But certainly what we've had as a result of this war is an Iranian regime that feels emboldened, that is more radical, if that's the right word. At least you have a leadership that is less fearful of taking risks. And again, you just put yourself in their shoes, it would be logical. They would think if only we had a nuclear weapon, because that way we might be able to deter the multiple attacks that we've been subjected to. So if that was the objective, it's certainly been carried out in the most counterproductive of ways.
Well, so then it raises the question of what would ultimately be productive. You mentioned there, Robert, the shifting of tactics. On one night, the president may be threatening to attack critical infrastructure. On the other, he says that he wants to low-key it and that he's just going to lean on economic levers. Which one is likely to be effective?
It depends what the goal is. I mean, if the goal was to get Iran at the negotiating table, they were at the negotiating table in 2025, and including just on the eve of this war. And according to reports by the mediators, Oman, but also British and others, Iran had put on the table not everything the U.S. wanted, but more than they'd put on the table in the past. And that pathway was at least had a chance of getting Iran to make commitments to invite the International Atomic Energy Agency to come back to do the inspections. They were prepared to agree to suspend enrichment for a number of years, something that it hadn't agreed to do, by the way, in 2015 under the JCPOA. So there were some steps that Iran might have been willing to take. But if the thought is by strangulating them economically or bombing them, that Iran is going to come and capitulate, then I'd only echo what Wendy Sherman told you yesterday. There is no way that this Iranian leadership is going to say, we surrender and we agree to all your demands because you're strangulating our economy or because you're striking us. They will, they will double down on their own actions, trying to make the U.S. and the rest of the world pay the price for the cost that they're incurring. But they're not going to suddenly say, we give up and everything you've asked for is now on the table. There is a way to negotiate with Iran. It's not an easy way, and it's become much more difficult because Iran has no faith, no trust in the U.S. and particularly in President Trump. But there is a far better way to doing it than what we've done. Just one short comment. We've now had 3 experiments in succession: diplomacy with the JCPOA, maximum economic pressure, that was the first Trump term and now, and war, which was what both the U.S. and Israel waged on Iran over the last several months and in 2025. Of those 3, only one got us closer to the objective of addressing Iran's nuclear program. That was diplomacy. That's the lesson that I think Americans should take to heart.
Okay, so if it is diplomacy that you ultimately think is the wisest course of action here, and your point is well understood that the sticks, whether they're military or economic sticks, have not proven effective in this iteration of the conflict. So what about carrots? If the U.S. were to offer greater sanctions relief to Iran, reintegrated in some way into the global economy, could that be something that unlocks the situation, or is that just too politically dangerous for the United States?
I mean, it's the only real carrot, quote unquote, or the incentive that the U.S. and the rest of the world have if their goal is to convince Iran to take steps on their nuclear program. Again, that was the equation. I know President Trump doesn't want to compare to the 2015 nuclear deal, so let's put that aside. But the only equation that's going to work for Iran is to get guarantees that it's not going to be attacked and some economic relief in exchange for taking real steps, meaningful steps, and they're going to have to be pressed to do so on their nuclear program. That's there's no third way. It's that. It's giving Iran both the assurance that it's not going to be struck again and economic relief. And they need the economic relief now, by the way, more than ever before, as a result of the what's been inflicted as a result of the war that's been waged upon them. So to rebuild their infrastructure, some economists have said that it would cost them $300 billion. Some have gone as far as saying it would cost them $1 trillion to rebuild what they lost. So yes, they're in desperate need of economic relief. And I suspect that a good negotiation, a tough negotiation, would get them to agree to nuclear compromises in exchange for economic relief. They've said so much, by the way, in all of the negotiations that have taken place to date. That's the way to do it. It's this, sooner or later we're going to have to come back to that. Sooner would be better than later, again, because of the price that Americans are paying at the gas pump, but more than that the rest of the world is paying because of the shortage of basic goods.
Well, when we consider the rest of the world, what about the rest of the Gulf states? It obviously was reported that it was Gulf allies that encouraged the president not to pursue an escalation of the military conflict for fear that their own infrastructure could be retaliation targets for Iran. Do they have a meaningful role to play in the outcome here other than advising against courses of action that they feel could backfire on them?
For sure, they have a big role to play. As you just said, arguing with the U.S., arguing with Iran, telling Iran that they want the Strait of Hormuz open, and if Iran wants to have normal relations with its Gulf neighbors, it's going to have to open the Strait of Hormuz to normal traffic. And also, most of these Gulf states have real economic leverage. If they can invest in Iran, they could buy from Iran, they could have economic trade with Iran, and those are the kinds of things that Iran is going to want and need. So the Gulf today probably has a more central role to play than it has had in the past. And it is one of the changes that needs to occur from the negotiations that took place in 2015. This time, Gulf states have and will need to have a central place in any negotiation, both because their interests are at stake and because they have something to offer both to Iran and to the United States.
All right, Robert, thank you so much for joining us. One of the negotiators of the 2015 deal, Robert Malley, we appreciate your time. Turning now to some of the other stories we're following in tonight's Power Brief. The deployment for sailors and Marines on the USS Abraham Lincoln began on November 21st. But after many extensions, there is still no official return date. The Lincoln has been supporting U.S. military operations in the Middle East, and now family members say multiple service members have reportedly attempted to jump overboard. The Military Times spoke with a wife who says her husband is now on medical hold after attempting to jump. In a separate incident on the Lincoln, a sailor on watch saw a shipmate flight preparing to go overboard and intervened. Roughly 5,000 personnel remain on the Lincoln, which was originally anticipated to return in May. Elsewhere, the Justice Department has reportedly convened a special grand jury that will be overseen by a close ally of U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro. A special grand jury has a focus on a single case and can issue a report after its investigation, even if there isn't enough evidence to go to trial. The Washington Post reporting this is a rare move for Pirro, saying it heard from 3 government officials familiar with the matter who spoke on the condition of anonymity. The grand jury move could set in motion investigations into some of Washington's most controversial cases. It's unclear what the focus will be, but those interviewed by the Post said that the move is significant and could be in President Trump's interest, as he has expressed interest in prosecuting his adversaries. And President Trump's Truth Media is facing a new lawsuit over its Truth API product, which plans to sell faster access to the president's market-moving social media posts for as much as $100,000 a month. 2 media organizations filing the suit today in New York asking the plan be blocked, calling it extraordinary, corrupt, and unconstitutional, as the president is the company's largest shareholder and stands to gain financially. Trump Media says Truth API aims to provide subscribers information without a latency gap and argues many other platforms offer similar subscriptions. Executives on an earnings call this week saying more than 10 customers, mostly high-speed trading firms, have signed up for the service. Still ahead, we'll hear from a Republican member of the Wisconsin delegation on last night's primary results and discuss our top stories with our political panel. That's ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lines. The recent wave of victories by progressive Democrats suffered a setback in Wisconsin last night in the party's closely watched gubernatorial primary. Moderate David Crowley defeated Democratic Socialist Francesca Hong in what turned out to be a closely contested race in a key battleground state and will now face off against Republican Tom Tiffany in November. We spoke about that race with Republican Congressman Brian Stile of Wisconsin earlier today.
In many ways, Wisconsin elections are almost always close, in this case, in the Democratic primary. But I think what Wisconsin voters will see in the near future is actually that David Crowley and Francesca Hong are in many ways 2 sides of the same coin. As the lights became brighter and people started to understand what Francesca Hong stands for, she became less popular. I think now people are going to focus in on David Crowley and actually recognize that they share many of the same policy goals. David Crowley raised taxes as he was county executive, in particular on the sales tax. You had Francesca Hong, who wanted to make Wisconsin the highest taxed state in the country. You have a series of mismanagement of Milwaukee County by David Crowley. We can't allow that type of mismanagement in Washington. And so he opened up his speech today by saying, "Let me introduce myself." That tells you Wisconsin voters don't really know who David Crowley is. Many of them, I think, voted against Francesca Hong and rejected the radical socialist policies that actually David Crowley supports himself. And so I feel good that at the end of this election, in 83 days, Tom Tiffany will be elected governor of the state of Wisconsin. I think voters writ large are done with the radical policies of the left, are looking for common sense reforms. And I think that's what Tom Tiffany will bring to our state.
Well, Tom Tiffany, by one metric, has been called the most conservative congressman in the Wisconsin delegation. He also denied the results of the 2020 election. Is that not radical?
I think what people are going to look at in particular is kitchen table issues, or Thanksgiving table issues, if you will, and look at the record of bringing down costs. We're going to look at what Tom Tiffany and I supported about reducing taxes, for example, on overtime, on Social Security, making life more affordable. Our work to unleash American energy, all the more important during this time of international turbulence. And so there's going to be a lot of back and forth. Wisconsin campaigns are always heated, always competitive. This will be a close race. But I think as people learn more about David Crowley, they'll recognize that his positions are extreme and that Tom Tiffany is bringing common sense reforms to our state that are needed at a period of time where families are struggling to make ends meet.
Well, it is not lost on us that Tiffany would be the first person who voted to overturn the 2020 election in Congress to become governor of a state like Wisconsin. Congressman, have you chosen to look through that for the sake of his other policy positions, or does it just not matter anymore?
Well, I think there's opportunities here to enhance our election integrity. I think, broadly speaking, the country recognizes and knows that. That's why I've been a forefront leader in making sure that we are verifying citizenship and that we're also using photo ID. And so I think what voters want to see is what policy is moving us forward. I don't think there's going to be a massive look back into 2020. I think voters want to know, what are you doing for us today to bring costs down and make life more affordable? And the contrast between Tom Tiffany and Republicans against the radical Democrats and David Crowley could not be more stark in the state of Wisconsin.
That was part of our conversation with Congressman Brian Stile. And joining me now for more is this evening's political panel, Democratic strategist Roger Fisk, former aide to President Obama and senior advisor at Burway Group, alongside Leslie Shedd, founder of Rising Communications, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council and Republican strategist. Welcome to you both. Roger, as the Democrat, I will come to you first on the results in Wisconsin. It was expected to be a blowout for Francesca Hong. It certainly wasn't. It was very narrow, and David Crowley won. Does that say more about polling or more about a divide within the Democratic Party?
Well, first off, thank you for having me. And I think polling is going through kind of an existential self-analysis pretty much every cycle, right? Like every year, every cycle, they're just like, how did we get this so wrong? But obviously you can take Michigan and Wisconsin and lump them together because I think a lot of the dynamics are the same. Very sophisticated, very purpley electorate. And what happens is in the primaries, the voices that tend to be louder are looked upon as having more momentum. And I think that's what happened in both of those situations, both in Michigan and Wisconsin, that people thought that the primary was going to be a blowout because of the insurgent kind of progressive campaign was just more out there on social media, making more noise, having more events, when in reality, the same dynamic played out in both states, which is you get down to the actual act of voting, especially with a sophisticated electorate. And you could see that a lot of people were like, hold on, we need to think not only of the primary, but also the general. And that's why those things tightened so much, in my mind. So that's just my initial analysis.
Okay. Is your initial analysis as a Republican that you would have rather Francesca Hong won this thing?
I mean, yeah, I think Democrats, dodged a real landmine here. But that being said, I mean, we are talking about a candidate that is limping across the finish line after a very bruising and, embattled primary.
David Crowley?
Yes, David Crowley. And, I also think, too, he was kind of drug across the finish line a little bit by Governor Evers. I think this is a good moment for him. I mean, he really showed his political strength here to be able to get him across the finish line. But at the same time, Tom Tiffany had, already gotten all of his support together. He has been building out his campaign. I think that's good for Republicans. On the polling note, I do want to flag, it wasn't just in those two states, right? We saw in Texas, for example, most of the polling showed that Ken Paxton would win by maybe 5 points, upwards of 10 points. He ended up winning by, I think, 27 points. And we saw the same thing in Minnesota as well, right? It was either Angie Craig and Flanagan were tied, or Angie was up by, about 5 points, and she ended up losing by 20 points, right? So we're at an existential kind of moment for polling right now. The one thing I will say is that matters because I think polling drives money in particular. And so I would encourage donors, don't listen to the polls right now. Go with your gut, figure out the candidate that you like, and don't just give, because I think that we're going to continue to see this throughout the cycle.
Direct to camera,
one
yeah.
brief. What I sensed happening with your conversation with the congressman was that even if the progressive lost in the primary, they're basically going to run against the moderate as if they're the progressive, right? So in Michigan, they got the candidate they wanted so they can move forward with their battle plan. In Wisconsin, they didn't get the candidate they wanted, but you could hear him telegraphing pretty clearly that they're going to run against the moderate as if the progressive won.
Well, are you surprised
No.
by that? The Democratic Party, if you listen to a Republican, is now synonymous with socialism and, depending on the Republican, communism. So how does the party combat that?
They just have to go. It's a shoe leather messaging war. And especially if you're an incumbent or a primary challenger, one of the things that I think is very important is to embrace the small businesses in your district and things like that, because you can be a champion of your community and you can be a champion of lower income people in your community while still being a champion of prosperity and economic success. And I think some on the left get that wrong.
Well, so if Democrats are having to make sure they can define themselves as not being a socialist, Republicans may very well have the same challenge because they're all going to be cast as being aligned with President Trump, by and large. And Trump right now is deeply unpopular, historically so. As we approach a general election, are you expecting Republicans to start to have to create a bit more distance between themselves and the occupant of the White House?
I mean, I think that always happens, depending upon the state, depending upon the district, right? I think that in this election in particular, I really feel like the candidate is going to actually matter here. I know we're looking at the polls, and the generic polls swing from, D+8 to D+2, and we'll see what ends up happening. But I really think in this instance, you could see places that are traditionally Republican districts or Republican Senate seats that maybe go to a Democrat, and traditionally left-leaning seats that go to a Republican. I think that it's going to be really based on the candidate this cycle.
I want to ask you both about some news that broke late in the day today. The White House press secretary, Karoline Leavitt, is going to leave her post at the end of the month, focus, the president says, on her young family. We don't know if anyone will replace her, who that person might be. And I wonder, Leslie, if you think this president is still one that needs a press secretary when he so frequently directly speaks with the press himself.
I think he still does. I mean, he does a lot of direct one-on-one conversations with the media and does a lot of press briefings. But you still need somebody that can help in the background, provide the background information that they're needing, the research, help set up off the records, help set up things. And she's been fantastic at that. I know there's kind of this idea that she's a pit bull up there when she's, briefing the press. But when you talk to people that are actually White House correspondents, they'll tell you that she's really great, that she's generous, she's kind, and she really does try to get them information that they need, which is what you want for a press secretary.
Well, when we consider the timing of her departure, she did recently just have a second child. She has 2 young children now, but it is also less than 3 months ahead of the midterms. And I wonder how that complicates things in your mind, Roger.
Yeah, in one sense, in a personal context, you would think that maybe the personal development of having her second child would be the catalyst for making this decision. Or in a professional context, the midterms would be, because traditionally after the midterms, there's a exodus of staff and you get in some fresh legs. It will shock absolutely no one in your viewership to hear that I have no visibility on the machinations inside this White House. But the other thing that we have to remember is this is an incredibly stressful, difficult job, even when the White House functions properly, which I think it's safe to say that this one is not kind of a well-structured, well-oiled machine. It's largely a personality driven by one person on any given day, and he can contradict himself 10 and 15 times in a day, which makes the job of the press secretary borderline impossible. And I can sympathize with someone who can only do it for 2 years.
We're about out of time. Just 30 seconds left. Leslie, to Roger's point about you typically see an exodus after the midterms, do you expect more administration officials could follow her lead?
I mean, I think working in the administration is exhausting. I have friends that do it, and they work, 12 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week. So I imagine, yes, after a year or two, you start to get tired. On the Karoline front, I do think we need to remember, don't forget, she's a campaign person still at heart. Mm-hmm. And it's not uncommon to see people leave official offices and go out on the campaign trail. He made it clear she's still going to be doing outside consulting work for him. I wouldn't be surprised if we see that.
All right. Leslie Shedd and Roger Fisk, our political panel this evening. Thank you both so much for joining me. And for more coverage, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online. And we'll see you back here tomorrow. Joe will be back on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.